Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Museum. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my privilege to serve as director of the museum here in Grand Rapids and also the library back in Ann Arbor. Planning for this afternoon's program began last June between museum staff and representatives of the Cooley Law School here in Grand Rapids. It later broadened into a coalition that included the Ford Presidential Foundation and the Grand Rapids Bar Association. This is a new collaboration for all of us, and I'm happy to report that there have been great ideas and terrific follow-through from all parties around the table. All of us on the planning team are delighted that you're with us this afternoon for the first annual Symposium on Ethics in Our World. In a reflection of the Ford Library and Museum's partnership with Cooley's multiple campuses, we're pleased to have some special guests with us today from various parts of Michigan. Joan Vestron, the Associate Dean of the Ann Arbor campus, is here in the front row. Amy Timmer, Associate Dean of Students and Professionalism from Lansing. Amy? Over there, okay. Nelson Miller, Dean of the Grand Rapids campus, is here. And Karen Rohlater from the Grand Rapids campus, who was a very active member of our planning committee. In addition, I'd like to mention Joe Calvaruso, the Executive Director of the Ford Foundation, who joined us and did a wonderful job in contributing to this program, and Kim Coleman, who is the Executive Director of the Grand Rapids Bar. So thank you all for being a great group to work with. Before addressing the format for today's program, I'd like to highlight a couple of upcoming programs of particular interest to this audience. Coming up in just a couple of weeks, March 30th at the library and on the 31st here at the museum, the Honorable William T. Coleman, the former Secretary of Transportation in the Ford administration, will be speaking. He has a new memoir called Counsel for the Situation, and it's going to be a wonderful program. So it's a Wednesday night in Ann Arbor and a Thursday night here at the museum. So I hope you'll put that on your calendars. And looking ahead to the summer, to President Ford's birthday, July 14th, we will be hosting the Justice Stevens in honor of President Ford's birthday. So that will be a real community celebration of the birthday. Since C-SPAN is covering this program, we've been asked to handle some matters of housekeeping during this first segment before they roll the tape. This is all just fake tape right now. First of all, please make sure your cell phones and pagers are turned off. Second, as you think of questions during the session, we've provided you with question cards. Please feel free to write down a question and pass it to either side of the auditorium. Our staff will collect them, and I'll do some organizing and pass them to our moderator. Finally, following this introductory segment, there will be a couple of minutes of tape roll before I come up again to start the program. So let me give you the format for today. We're going to open with remarks by Steve Ford, who I will introduce in just a few minutes. The moderator for the panel of distinguished leaders is Victoria Vuletich, Professor of Professional Responsibility at the Cooley Law School here in Grand Rapids. Prior to joining the Cooley faculty, Victoria was Deputy Director of the Professional Standards Division of the State Bar of Michigan for 9 years and has experience in private practice handling family law and personal injury matters. She is a leader in the American Bar Association's professional responsibility efforts, and frankly, Victoria deserves full credit from all of us as the inspiration and the advocate to plan this ethics symposium. Now I'd like to invite Susan Wilson Keener, who is president of the Grand Rapids Bar Association and the Justice Foundation of West Michigan, to the podium. The Justice Foundation, along with the Ford Presidential Foundation, is co-sponsoring the reception following the program. Susan, over to you.
On behalf of the Grand Rapids Bar Association and the Justice Foundation, welcome everyone for what is the first ethics symposium. The Grand Rapids Bar Association and the Justice Foundation they are honored to be a part of this symposium. I am looking forward to what I'm sure will be a lively dialogue and discussion of these very important issues in our society. And I also have the pleasure of reminding you and welcoming you to the reception which we are co-sponsoring. And please do attend that reception. We hope that you will have more dialogue. We'll get a chance to meet the speakers, and we'd like to hear from you what you think of this symposium, what ideas you might have, because we hope that this would be something that could be repeated. So again, welcome, and now we can move forward with this wonderful program.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Ford Presidential Museum. My name is Elaine Didier and it's my pleasure to serve as director, and I'm delighted to have you here with us this afternoon. For this first ever ethics symposium, we are especially honored to welcome Stephen Ford, son of President Ford, who has successfully traveled the road from a teenager in the White House to a very successful and most interesting and eclectic career. At various times, and sometimes simultaneously, Steve has been a cowboy, rancher, actor, businessman, corporate spokesman, and motivational speaker to corporate and student audiences alike. On August 9, 1974, when Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States, Steve and his three siblings suddenly went from being the kids down the block, living typical private lives as suburban young adults, to the only kids on the block at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The media spotlight was instantaneous and intense, and not always easy to handle, but Steve and his siblings survived and thrived. He's here with us today to give us an insider's view of his father's values throughout his distinguished life and career, and to share with us the lessons he's learned, first as the son of the president, and then as a successful figure in his own right. Please welcome the chairman of the Gerald Ford Presidential Foundation, Steve Ford.
Welcome. Thank all of you for being here. Before I get started, just thank Cooley Law School and the Grand Rapids Bar Association and the foundation, the Ford Foundation, for all putting this program on. Dad, if he were alive today, would tell you that this is what he wants from the Museum, Library, Foundation, to create a situation where this place becomes sort of the town square where we all come together and we discuss ideas and one side versus the other, and we find out what we think about different issues. And the topic tonight, ethics, certainly is a moving target. I'm not sure I'm quite qualified to be up here. We have a lot of lawyers and things like that, but I guess, to sort of let you sort of drop the drawbridge to my soul. 18 years ago, I can look back at my life, and ethics was certainly a big part, because I, at that time, was struggling with alcoholism and found myself in many situations that I would look at today and think that's not ethical behavior. And so I come here today with my own stories, but I'm glad to say 18 years later, I've got 18 years of sobriety and the grace of God and a good 12-step program, a great mother who helped me get through that period. But I come as a humble human being that faces these ethical choices every day of what we should do, what we think about doing. It's a fascinating subject. We could spend hours, obviously, on this, and this could go on for days. You've got medical ethics, you've got government ethics, the golden rule. It's a fascinating subject. Sometimes it's a dilemma. It's a moving target. Sometimes it concerns the law. Sometimes it doesn't concern the law. You think about I'm fascinated by this subject. You think about somebody, the old story of Robin Hood, right? Stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. And you could make a case that his stealing was unethical, but giving to the poor was moral. You could make a case for a spouse cheating on her partner in a marriage. Obviously unethical, but probably not broken a law. So sometimes law is involved, sometimes not. Some states there might be a law that would dictate something about that, but it's never prosecuted. So it's a moving target and a fascinating conversation for all of us here tonight. When I thought about this subject, I thought what were some of the most recent situations that ethics get involved. I think of the recent financial meltdown in the last several years in banks and loans and institutions like that. And it worked on both ways. You had sophisticated loan officers who were dealing with unsophisticated applicants for a loan and convinced them to, at times, not always, but at times, to take a loan out that they couldn't afford. And profits, the demand for profits, there was a lot of pressure there in what I would say was somewhat of an unethical decision. And it worked the other way. You had sophisticated people who were trying to get a loan and walked in and purposely misrepresented their income or their worth to get a loan. And so the ethics of it worked both ways, at both sides of the equation. Tonight, my little time up here, I want to start the discussion with a few examples of how I saw my father live his life. And I think he tried on a daily basis to live it in a very, very ethical way. If you look at, we were talking before the program here, and if you look at Dad, probably the biggest public example probably of Dad's administration, of his time in politics, dealing with a tough ethical decision was dealing with Watergate and the Nixon pardon. But before you can really talk about the pardon, you have to go back before Dad was even president, because some things had to fall in place for him to even have that chance to make that decision about the Nixon pardon. You have to go back to 1971 when a group of men, as we all know them today, was the Plumbers, who were established by a White House advisor, John Ehrlichman. They were later called the Special Investigation Unit, or SUI, and the Plumbers, before Watergate, some of you might remember the Plumbers went in and broke into Daniel Ellsberg's, who was the Pentagon Papers, his psychiatrist's office in Los Angeles, I believe in 1971. And they were trying to get information detrimental to Daniel Ellsberg to stop more classified information on the war in Vietnam and the SALT agreements that the U.S. was dealing with the Russians. And some of those papers showed the fallback position of the United States during the height of the Cold War. And they made a decision to illegally break in to Daniel Ellsberg's doctor's office under the banner of national security. They made a choice. And they broke some laws to do that. But the men and those men and the White House saw this as a national security issue, and they felt they were answering what they felt at that time was a higher calling to the President of the United States and not the laws of this nation. That situation was in 1971-72. The same group of Plumbers, as we all know, broke into the Watergate Hotel, the Democratic headquarters, and Watergate was started. All of that fell into place, which caused the Nixon presidency to come tumbling down eventually. Now, Dad, on the other hand, and this is what I find fascinating about this story, as all this was happening in 1973, as Watergate had already started, Richard Nixon had to find a new vice president because his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had stepped down from office, also because of unethical behavior. And Dad's name was on the list. Let's see, he'd been a congressman for about 25 years from here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His name was put on the list with about 10 other people that possibly might be chosen as the next vice president to replace Spiro Agnew. To be honest with you, we thought Dad's name was at the bottom of that list. Other names would have been Governor Rockefeller of New York, former governor of Texas, John Connally, men that had greater national presence than Dad, who was the House Minority Leader in Congress. But the foundation was being laid in Dad's life early on as he grew up in Grand Rapids, and the people that invested in his life. He sort of had the image of being a straight shooter, the Boy Scout, the square, and when it came to making a decision about picking a new vice president, the most important thing to Nixon at that time was to make sure his choice could get through Congress. And there was no controversy about Dad. He was that Boy Scout image, very ethical, worked with both sides, both aisles of Congress, and both sides of Congress could reach out across the aisle and find compromise. So as you had the plumbers and going this way with unethical decisions, you had Jerry Ford rising up and being needed because he was making very ethical decisions. Well, as Dad first became vice president, a little side note here, my mother had finally got him to retire. That was going to be his last term in Congress. He was going to come back to Grand Rapids, Michigan, be a lawyer, and he'd been in Congress for 25 years. And he said, if we don't win a majority and the Republicans take over Congress and I don't become Speaker of the House, I'll go back to Grand Rapids, start my law practice up again. And Mom was relieved, trust me. After 25 years in Washington, D.C., she wanted to come home. And so all of a sudden in October of 1973, Richard Nixon calls Dad to ask him to be the vice president. And my mother was not happy. And I'll never forget my dad trying to sort of calm her down and relieve her. You know, she thought we were going to move back to Michigan, and here he was going to be vice president. And I remember my dad saying to Mom, "Betty, don't worry, vice presidents don't do anything." So that turned out to be false, as we all know. So, well, thinking about the pardon, a month after Dad took office, the pardon happened. Now, let me walk you back 30 days earlier. Everybody remembers the image of the helicopter with Nixon taking off from the south lawn of the White House and Nixon waving goodbye. I stood there with my parents, watched Nixon leave. We went into the east room of the White House, went into the east room of the White House where Dad took the oath of office. Now, this was not a joyous occasion. This was somewhat a constitutional crisis. You had a man who was now going to take over the reins of this country. We had the Vietnam War going on. We had a huge recession. The stock market had lost 45% of its value in the last 6 months. Cold War with the Russians. And you had a man who was going to walk in and take the oath of office who had not been elected by the American people. It had never happened before in this country. Dad goes and becomes president and then finds himself 30 days later in a situation where Nixon, well, let me back up just a little bit. Right after Dad became president, Nixon went to California. One of the first requests that the president's staff had back to the White House was to send all the documents, papers, and tapes out to San Clemente. And many of them were still in the basement of the White House. Dad said absolutely not. There was still a criminal case pending. Nixon still had potential charges criminally against him. But the Justice Department ruled that every former president owns their papers, documents, tapes. Now, that wasn't Dad's Justice Department. That was Richard Nixon's Justice Department. He inherited it. But Dad refused. He thought that was not the right thing to do. It had to be preserved as evidence. And you know, I remember sitting there thinking, wait a second, if this stuff goes to California, there's probably going to be a huge bonfire on the beach tomorrow morning. I mean, that was the reality of the situation, and he found himself going against his own Justice Department. Congress at that time was spending 25% of their every day dealing with Richard Nixon. He was still in the headlines. Dad was spending 25% of his every day dealing with Richard Nixon, even though he had the Vietnam War, the Cold War, and the recession going on. After speaking with several people, Congress, the special prosecutor, Nixon could have dragged this out for 4 or 5 years in the courts. And I think that's where Dad finally came to the decision that he had to do something to clear the deck, get Nixon out of the way so the country could move on and deal with the war in Vietnam, Cold War with the Russians, the recession. The pardon was the answer. The pardon, they researched it, and they based their pardon on a 1933 ruling by the Supreme Court. It was, I think it was called the Burdick case. It was where a man was, I think he was held in federal custody, and the government wanted him to testify, and they said they'd give him a pardon, and he refused the pardon because he said he wasn't guilty of anything. And I think the Supreme Court had ruled that by granting a pardon, it was an implication of guilt. If you accepted the pardon, it was an acceptance of that guilt. Benton Becker, who was Dad's legal counsel on the pardon in the Nixon situation, went out to San Clemente, met with former President Nixon, explained to President Nixon that their pardon was based on the 1933 Burdick case, that by giving the pardon there was a implication of guilt, and if he accepted it, there was an acceptance of that guilt. Nixon initially turned it down for several days. Didn't want to accept it under those terms. They knew at that moment, President Nixon was not going to say publicly that he had committed crimes or done anything, but finally Nixon came back and accepted the pardon under those terms. It cost Dad, it basically ended his political career. They knew that going in. Dad knew that it would probably cost him 5 to 10% of the vote when he ran for election against Jimmy Carter. But in his mind, and just knowing my dad and seeing how he operated, it wasn't about him. It wasn't. It was about the country, and he felt very strongly that the country had to move forward, and the only way to do that was to push Nixon out of the way, and so they could start dealing with the economy and unemployment and inflation and the Vietnam War. And I think Dad's roots came back here to Grand Rapids, and his roots were about being a public servant and serving the public. And I think he was willing to give up his political future thinking long-term instead of short-term. I'm always amazed because one of the things that's forgotten about the Nixon pardon is at the same time that he pardoned Richard Nixon, he went and gave a speech in front of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, Veterans Association, and also recommended there be amnesty, a program set up so young men who had dodged the draft and went to Canada could come back, see their families, come back, and not be prosecuted. And it was very symbolic of what he was trying to do, that it wasn't about Nixon, and it was about putting your arms around the whole country and healing this nation and bringing people back home. It did cost him an election. There's no doubt about it. I don't think he would ever regret his decision. He knows he did the right thing at the right time. It does come full circle in the end. I was curious, one of the books, and I highly recommend you read it, because as I looked at this, I wanted to read some of the material by some of the people that were involved in the Watergate situation. And a great book that I finished a couple of weeks ago is by Bud Crow, who was one of the original co-directors of the plumbers unit that worked under John Ehrlichman. And he went to jail, went to prison, but I found it very interesting. He had a complete transformation from what I can tell of realizing what they tried to justify under the name of national security, serving the president, and breaking laws was not right. That he finally admitted his guilt, went to prison. And in his book, it's interesting because he talks about we made unethical decisions. Our allegiance to our superiors, to the president's staff, got in front of our allegiance to the law of this nation and the Constitution. Early on in the book, on page 2, he writes, "Why did this burglary happen? I am convinced that a collapse of integrity among those of us who conspired, ordered, and carried out this action was the principal cause. Complete transformation, and he talks about how you get caught up in that power and serving a president. Dad, in his speech, talked about that we found out we were a nation of laws and not just one man, and that our laws were more important than one man's ambition. I want to sort of running out of time here and get. I do want to share one thing with you. I had another story I was going to talk about, but as this comes full circle, 20 years after the Nixon pardon, after Dad lost the election to Jimmy Carter, it did make this complete turn because Dad was invited to the John F. Kennedy Museum and Library by Carolyn Kennedy and Senator Ted Kennedy to receive the John F. Kennedy Award for courage in public service because of the Nixon pardon. And Senator Ted Kennedy stood up there and talked about how 20 years earlier, he thought Dad had sold the country out, and it looked like an unethical decision to him at that point. And he could see with 20 years of history, to see what it was really about, trying to heal a nation and bring a country back together and heal the wounds of that nation. I want to close with one thing that I think speaks of Dad and this idea of, this world becomes so competitive, sometimes we got to win at any cost and those kind of things. Dad wrote some writings for when he wrote his book, and he took a yellow legal pad and he picked about 20 subjects that he thought were important to a young man or a young woman growing up in this country today. Subjects like what is character, integrity. This one is learning how to lose. And he bound that book and gave it to all his kids. And I remember as a young man when he gave me the book, he said, Steve, these are some of my core values, and I wrote this down. And this is a copy of one of the pages. This one is on learning how to lose. But you can see it's handwritten, did one page or less, and gave it to it. And I remember when he came to me, I wasn't as impressed as I should have been. And, when you're that age, it goes above your head. And he said, Steve, I want to be accountable to you guys. And I'm looking at it and go, oh, great, Dad, I'll put that right here. But 18 years ago, trust me, 18 years ago when I was going through my alcoholism, and I picked up this book with his writings on these 20 subjects about character and integrity and things like that, core values, it was one of the things that helped save my life. And I was living in some unethical areas. And it was one of the tools I used, his wisdom, to get up off my knees and reclaim my life and get sober. But I'm going to read one of these to you, and then I'm going to turn this over to Victoria and the rest of our group. But there's a great wisdom in this. And he titled it, Learning How to Lose. And it says, in this highly competitive society, there's always a winner and always a loser. Even the best sometimes lose because of circumstances beyond their control or because of unintended mistakes. But to walk off the playing field as a sorehead or with a public display is not good for one's conscience or for one's reputation. Losing should be looked upon as a lesson so you can do better the next time. The disappointment should not bemoan the spirit, rattle one's composure, sidetrack a well-organized plan, or preclude another effort. Learning to lose is to recognize that one setback is not the end, but in reality can be a new incentive to reach and achieve higher goals. A lot of wisdom there, and I think thoughts like that pertain to ethics, how you live your life. You don't win at all costs, you don't cheat, you don't break the rules, and we live in a society today that demands a lot out. You look at baseball and steroids and all these things. There's a lot of pressure on young people, on adults, and we have to ask ourselves that question of what should we do, what we should be doing. And I remember, and I think Dad told me one time he was at a talk that great insight. Billy Graham had spoken, and he and Billy Graham were talking afterwards. And I don't think I quite understood it when he said it, but I think I understand it better today. And Billy Graham, and this is not a direct quote, but very close, he was telling Dad, he says, the greatest challenges before us are not going to be medicine, technology, and finances and things like that. The greatest challenge is going to be taming the heart, our appetites. Taming the heart. And to tame the heart, I do think you have to look at these things, these ethical questions of what is right, what is wrong. I thank you. You're a good audience. I love the discussion and the back and forth. And at this time, I would like to invite Victoria up here, and we're going to hopefully have a lively discussion and sort of be the town square for Grand Rapids today. Thank you all very, very much.
Well, we are very fortunate today to have with us three outstanding leaders to explore and discuss the role of ethics in shaping and regulating our society and the question of whether America still has moral integrity. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes and then we'll entertain your questions. Our first panelist who will speak today is Brigadier General Michael C.H. McDaniel. He's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense Strategy, Prevention, and Mission Assurance, where his duties included supervising the Department of Defense Critical Infrastructure Protection Program, the Global Anti-Terrorism Force Protection Policy Program, and serving as the liaison from the Department of Defense to the White House and Congress on Homeland Security matters. In 2003, Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm appointed General McDaniel as her advisor on Homeland Security. General McDaniel recently joined the faculty of Thomas M. Cooley Law School, where he will develop a program in Homeland Security law. General McDaniel earned his law degree from Case Western Reserve University School of Law, a Master of Strategic Studies from the Army War College, and Master of Arts in Security Studies from the Naval Postgraduate School. General McDaniel has been a member of the Michigan National Guard for 24 years. Our second panelist today is Terry Lynn Land. She served as Michigan's 41st Secretary of State from 2003 through 2010. An advocate of voting rights, Ms. Land partnered with disability advocates to implement the first voting equipment designed specifically for people with disabilities and to ensure that local polling places are accessible to disabled voters. The Michigan Rehabilitation Conference honored Ms. Land with its 2006 Excellence Award for these achievements. During her tenure as Secretary of State, Ms. Land expanded online services and reorganized the branch office structure to better serve Michigan residents. In recognition of her success, she was presented with a Distinguished Leader Award by the Michigan Business and Professional Association in 2007, an honor given to women who have demonstrated successful leadership. She is a graduate of Hope College and was awarded an Honorary Doctor of Public Services by Central Michigan University. And our last panelist today is filling in for Tony Jenkins, the State Bar of Michigan president, who unfortunately fell ill. We all wish Tony a speedy recovery, but we are very happy to have with us today Bruce Cortade, who is the vice president of the State Bar of Michigan and will serve as its president beginning September of 2012. Mr. Cortade has practiced law for 22 years. He is a partner in the Grand Rapids firm of Rhodes McKee, where his practice emphasized civil and commercial litigation. Mr. Cortade is the recipient of the John W. Comiskey Award, given to one attorney each year by the State Bar of Michigan in recognition of outstanding pro bono contributions to Michigan citizens. He has served on the board of directors for the Grand Rapids AIDS Resource, has been named as one of Grand Rapids' top 40 under 40, and has been designated a super lawyer in commercial litigation every year since 2006. He earned his undergraduate and law degrees from the University of Michigan. So please welcome our panelists. And we'll begin with the general.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Distinguished guests, Mr. Ford, my colleagues from the Cooley Law School, law students and others. I really appreciate this opportunity. If I could take one moment of to interject a personal moment, Mr. Ford, I greatly appreciate you mentioning about your father's career as a Boy Scout. I can tell you that in the late 1970s, when I was awarded my Eagle Scout, it was certainly considered a sort of square at that point as well. And having as our president the only recipient of the Eagle Scout Award meant the world to all of us at that point in time. And I appreciate you mentioning that both today and, of course, in the Grand Rapids Press article. That love of scouting your father exhibited right up to the very end, and it was very heartwarming to be present at the funeral procession and see all the Boy Scouts lining the streets of this great city. Thank you all. I want to talk to you today about the concept of whether there is in fact a separate ethic for the American public. Do we have a separate ethic for this country? I think it differs depending upon each country. I submit to you that we do in fact have an ethic, that it continues, and I would submit to you also that it is based in our Constitution. I would suggest to you that this is certainly not a new concept. In the first decision that every law student reads, Marbury versus Madison, back in 1803, Chief Justice Marshall specifically referred to the oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States that every judge takes. And of course, if you look at Article 4 of the Constitution, that oath is not limited to judges. It also talks about the president. It talks about members of state legislatures. It talks about every member of the judiciary and executive office of the several states. So it was intended that by our framers of the Constitution that all of our public officers take that oath to support and defend the Constitution. And this is really of no small moment because it impresses upon you when you take that oath not just the august nature of the position, but more importantly, the responsibilities and where those responsibilities are grounded. As an attorney, as an assistant attorney general, as an officer in the U.S. Army, as a general officer, as a deputy assistant attorney general, I recently was resworn into the Michigan National Guard last month, and each time I took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. And so I think that oath, and of course an oath is much more than a promise. It's a covenant with a higher being. It's a covenant with your God, whoever you believe him to be, him or her to be, but with that supreme being, that you are taking that solemn oath to defend the Constitution. Now, how do I get from that to a public ethic? Well, there are two sort of themes there. One of them is not really unique, I think, to the United States, and that is the one that's contained in the preamble of the Constitution where it says to promote the general welfare. Certainly, given our history at that time, we were throwing off the political ties that bound us to the king. We were transferring sovereignty from the king to the people. We were transferring the ownership of property generally from the king to the people. And so there was an understanding of this collective welfare, of this collective self-interest, if you will, and the need to promote that general welfare. So I would suggest that is one of the two main tenets of the public ethic in America that comes from the Constitution. The second one I would suggest, I think, is in fact unique to this country, and that is the idea of protecting the self-interest. It is perhaps more subtle, but it is definitely as fundamental to the Constitution. When the framing of the Constitution is not simply democratic, it is certainly not majoritarian, it was a federalist system as well. There was the idea that they were protecting the small state and they were protecting the individual. And so I think that it created a community as it created this balance and checks of powers between the branches. And what they were doing was assuring the interests of the individuals would not be lost. And that was very, very important, I think, to the framers for individuals, as I said, as well as the larger states. And those two, I think, are always in tension. There's a dynamic, between the two of them. And I think that is the part that causes, as Mr. Ford said, this pendulum to swing, this dynamic, where sometimes there is more of an interest in the selfish interests of the individuals, and sometimes there's a greater interest, perhaps in times of crisis, in that collective interest. Because there is no black and white. It will always be this gray area. For example, just last week, or perhaps it was 2 weeks ago now, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 that the Westboro Baptist Church has the right to protest in vehement fashion at funerals of military members. And I can tell you, having been to a number of military funerals over the last 10 years, that there is nothing more somber, there is nothing more important to this nation that we recognize those individuals and the sacrifice that they made in support of that Constitution and in support of all of us. And yet, the Constitution does permit that, because there's that tension between the collective interest and the self-interest. And so, no matter how abhorrent, no matter how detestable, we have to permit that speech. We can certainly permit it to be 1,000 feet away and put other guarantees there, but we have to recognize that speech as well. So there is a constant tension, as I said, between these two values, and both of those values, I would submit, are ones that we have to uphold. To give an example that I think will still resonate today, but from over 150 years ago, Lieutenant Stephen Decatur was a young Navy lieutenant in both the War of 1812 and the Barbary Wars, and he said at a dinner, he stood up and he gave the following toast: "Our country, in her intercourse with foreign nations, may she always be in the right, but our country, right or wrong." And I think that last piece, "our country, right or wrong," has sort of been seized upon by jingoists and self-proclaimed patriots many times, but again, that only refers to that collective interest. It doesn't refer to the overall dynamic that we have, where we have to balance the interest of self with that of our collective nation. John Quincy Adams, in responding to that oath, having heard about that toast, in a letter to his father, said that he could not join his voice in that toast. He said, "I cannot ask of heaven success, even for my country, in a cause where she would be in the wrong. Fiat justitia periat coelum," which means, "let justice be done, though the heavens fall." And that's a phrase that I've often used when I talk with my students, my soldiers, or my staff. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. And the reason for that is that it strikes me as very similar to one of the key lessons that we learned in Army War College, which is sort of the mandatory schooling that every officer has to have before they can be considered for general rank, for anything above colonel. And that is, as we sort of synopsize it in the military, you have to be able to throw your stars on the table. You have to be able to give up your rank, everything that you held dear your entire career, to do the right thing. So exactly as Mr. Ford said, talking about his father's decision to pardon Nixon, he knew that that decision politically was going to be devastating. So every Army officer is taught these days that you have to be able to throw your stars on the table. Let me give just one example of that. In the time after September 11th, 2001, over 400 individuals, of course, were interned in Guantanamo Bay, and there was a question as to who was going to represent these. Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine JAGs were all sort of assigned as defense counsel. So you had individuals, and like the individuals that were assigned to Salim Hamdan, who was the Yemeni who was Osama bin Laden's driver, as one of them said, he said, I went from doing drunk driving cases and positive drug tests to one of the most highly visible court cases in the nation, if not in the world. They rose to the occasion. They sued Secretary Rumsfeld in federal court on the grounds that the military tribunal violated the Constitution, the Geneva Conventions, and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They were, in fact, correct. Many, many years later, after 3 or 4 years of finally getting the case up to the Supreme Court, Justice John Paul Stevens wrote the opinion on behalf of the majority. So consider again, Justice John Paul Stevens, to bring this full circle, was the one Supreme Court justice who was appointed by President Gerald Ford. I think similar interests, I think similar character, similar integrity must have existed all the way through. As we heard Mr. Ford say earlier tonight, it was that understanding of the need for integrity in that decision, and the sense, as he said, that no man is above the law. And that was certainly true as well in the opinion by Justice Stevens, as he specifically said in the Hamden opinion that individual rights and national security have to be upheld. And let me find my quote here as I come to an end. And he concluded the executive, meaning the president, is bound to comply with the rule of law which prevails in this and every jurisdiction. So in closing, I would say, as I said before, there's always an ethical question, and every ethical question, if you will devolve down to that simple calculus. To what extent does the general collective interest prevail, and to what extent do we allow the individual's interest as well?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Land? Well, it's great to be here, and it's great to be here with you, Steve Ford, and the Gerald R. Ford Museum and Library has been a great asset to our community. I was born and raised here in this side of town, and to have the opportunity as a high school student to actually work on a presidential campaign, it wasn't until I was a little older that I appreciated what I had in that opportunity. And of course, President Ford became a mentor of mine when I got involved in politics. I started out wanting to be a teacher, but after on the campaign, I realized I wanted to run for office. Which of course then brought up the question of how do you run for office, and that reflective question that you have to have when you get elected, and how you make decisions and what you can do. I think I'm up here to be the practical person, not being the lawyer here. I think everybody's a lawyer, right? Okay. And even though I was the court clerk for Kent County and served on the Attorney Grievance Commission, I do understand how lawyers work a little bit, but I think maybe what I'm going to bring to this is the practical part of all of this. And I think that's where it comes in, and how you make decisions and how important it is to get the information. As county clerk, my policy always was I talk to anybody. If you wanted to come in and have a cup of coffee with me, we could talk. But nobody was buying lunch, nobody was paying for a conference, nobody was doing those types of things. But you do need to talk to everybody, and I truly believe in government to make good decisions, you do need to have conversations with everyone. And President Ford was definitely of that too, that he wanted to hear all sides. My staff meetings at the Secretary of State's office were always very engaging, is the word I like to use, because I had folks who had different philosophies. I had people who were very conservative, people who were very liberal, people who had government experience, people who had business experience. And that created a lot of dynamics, but also allowed you to make some good decisions. Now, I'm going to talk a little about campaign finance in a minute, but I thought I'd first kind of give you a view of how, how we make decisions in government and how we come to conclusions dealing with all the influences you have out there. And that is a challenge, because now that technology is part of our lives, and you get bombarded on cable and TV and Facebook and Twitter and all of that, you have to make sure that you're getting the right information and the correct information to make decisions, because you're dealing with taxpayers' dollars and people's lives and their families. And so it's really important that you really look into the information that you get and make sure that it's good and accurate information when you make those decisions, because they affect a lot of people's lives. On the election side, I brought along Bill Ballinger, who puts a newsletter called out in Inside Michigan Politics, and he did a survey, a poll, he likes to do polls, to find out how people thought about ethics in Michigan and government on the campaign finance side. Now in Michigan, we like to say we have no ethics. Well, we do have ethics. But what I mean by that is that we don't have the same type of procedures and rules as far as running for office and declaring your income, your stocks, any holdings you may have, any relations you may have, like Congress does. And I explained to people in Michigan, it's a little different. We're kind of unique here. We have really one industry that dominates our state. And no matter what income level you're at, you have GM stock, Ford stock, Chrysler stock. So it would never occur to anybody that that would be unethical to have that stock go into the legislature and then vote on legislation that affects the auto industry. Because we're all in one team here in Michigan, and in Michigan it's about the autos. So in other states where you don't have that one industry that dominates the whole entire state, and they do look at it differently. If you have maybe some GM stock and you go into the legislature and you vote on an issue that affects the auto industry, people will, you should disclose that. That's important. Well, we've never had that in Michigan, and whether you're Democrat or Republican or Independent or Green Party, you have a family member, if not yourself, that worked in the auto industry. So those kind of issues were never really brought up to the forefront. And just to give you an idea, on the poll they took, they actually asked people if it made a difference if they fully disclosed their sources of income like they do with candidates for Congress, and only 43% of the people in Michigan thought it was even important. So it's just not something that Michigan has really talked about. In fact, also, they've also asked the question, if 50% ceiling on the portion of campaign funds would come from lobbyists, is that important to you? 20% of the people thought that was important. I mean, you just go down the list of all those kind of campaign finance issues, and it really falls down to 20 and even 18% as far as the campaign finance goes, for example, with public financing of candidates. In Michigan, we have, of course, the ability to public finance your gubernatorial campaigns. And every year, less and less people have been contributing to it, and now it's down to 18% of the people who even think that's important anymore. So it's kind of interesting out there when people start talking about campaign finance and all of that, but the reality is most people don't think there's really a problem. And we do have transparency in Michigan, which I think is important. As long as you get a contribution, you need to be able to let folks know what it is. In fact, while I was Secretary of State, I did have legislation that I put forward. Wasn't successful in getting it passed and signed by the governor, but what I wanted to do was have what's called like real-time campaign finance reporting, meaning that if you got $100 from Joe Smith, before you could actually spend it, you'd have to put it in the bank and then declare it, and it'd be up on a website in real time, so everyone could see that you got $100 from Joe Smith, and you would actually know what these candidates got before you voted for them. Because right now people play the game where they don't put down the contributions until after the election's over, and all they do is pay a fine, and a lot of them see it as a cost of doing business. And so this way you'd know ahead of time. For example, within a month, if all of a sudden the billboards go up, the yard signs go up, but there's no campaign contributions coming in, well, right away you can go after that and find out what's going on, and then the public will know that they haven't disclosed their contributions. So that's one of the things that I put forward. It's still out there. I'm hoping that somebody will take that up. But I think transparency is the biggest issue. People just want to know where the money is coming from. But the reality of, like the polling number shows, it doesn't make really a difference of how much. It's just the transparency of it. People seem to want to know that. And I think that's really where that should go. So, and then, of course, there's a few other things that we deal with that I've dealt with at the Secretary of State's office. And when you talked about my resume, it reminded me of that. There was a big discussion about having polling places accessible to folks with disabilities. And there'd been a lot of conversation before that said, oh, it costs too much money, and we can't do it because we just can't afford it. Well, that's just an excuse in my world. Because if it's the right thing to do, you should do it. And that's why we went ahead and did that when we were in the Secretary of State's office, is improve polling places, made them more accessible for people with disabilities, because it's just right. And my favorite story from that whole process of the modernizing the elections in Michigan was a woman who'd been sight impaired all her life, never been able to vote in secret because she always had to have someone help her fill out her ballot. Well, we put our new systems in, our new machines in. She went into the polling place, voted by herself in secret for the first time. She was 65 years old, stood up in the middle of the polling place and said, "God bless America." And, of course, the clerk called our office right away and told us the story. And, I mean, that's what it's all about. Making it accessible, having it transparent, and that's what government should be. So there's my presentation for you.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess I get to back clean up. And first off, I want to thank you for the honor of being here, Mr. Ford. As I mentioned previously, it's an honor to be involved in anything involving Gerald Ford's name. As a practicing lawyer in Grand Rapids, he is definitely a hero and somebody who we all aspire to be. I was asked to focus on legal ethics, and the first thing I'd like to point out is that is not an oxymoron. But when I sat down and thought about it, what does that mean in this context? And I was told once that ethics involves, or being an ethical person is someone who always does more than what's required but less than what is permitted. And in the legal context, that rings very true. In the state of Michigan, our Bar Association is self-regulated. What that means is that the attorney discipline system is run by the lawyers with the ultimate oversight of the Supreme Court, but all of the attorney grievances that are filed come before the members of the state bar. We self-police. I came up with some statistics because I was trying to figure out how are we doing in the state of Michigan? In 2001, there were 34,473 members of the state bar. That year, there were 3,575 requests for investigation, which means that basically there was a 10.37% rate of infraction, rate of incident. In 2010, there were 41,133 lawyers and only 2,803 requests for investigation. So what that would seem to indicate is that, boy, we're doing better ethically. That runs sort of contrary to what one would think. So I think we had to focus on a few things. One thing that I would urge you to consider is there are a lot of challenges going on right now for those of us who are in the legal profession that impact the way we do business and the pressures that are on us as practicing lawyers. I believe that in today's world, as we're becoming more high-tech, more fast-paced, less interpersonal, no face-to-face communications anymore, I think that there's a change in our cultural ethos that trickles all the way through society, including the way that we practice law. I want to say I feel very fortunate to be practicing law in the state of Michigan, and particularly in West Michigan. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. But I want to focus on a couple of factors that I think really affect what's going on in the legal business right now. The first is the slowing economy. Martin Luther King once said that the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge. Well, clearly, for anybody from Michigan, you understand that we are in a challenging economy right now. According to published reports, 20 years ago, Michigan had more than 140 publicly traded corporations which were based in Michigan. And they came up with this Michigan Stock Index, which featured the top 100 of those companies. 2 years ago, there were fewer than 90 companies publicly traded based in Michigan, so they can't even come up with the top 100 anymore. The Michigan Department of Energy, Labor, and Economic Growth statistics are startling. We've lost 593,000 jobs since 2003. 13.4% of Michigan's workforce has been eliminated in that time. So we are the only state of the 50 that's lost population in the last 50 years. In the last census. So what does that mean? I submit to you that the impact on lawyers and law firms is predictable. The first, there's a new term going around in the legal business. I love it. It's called the unhiring of associates. They don't get fired, they get unhired. So, but there's also fewer jobs out there for new law school graduates. What happens then is you have these grads who they're not being hired by the law firms. They're forced to go out and become solo practitioners, which, nothing against solo practitioners. Some of the best lawyers I know are in small firms and individual attorneys. But for a new attorney coming out, they don't have a mentor. They don't have somebody who's been there who can show them the ropes and can point out potential minefields that they're going to step into if they don't watch out. The other thing that's going on is there are more and more lawyers being pumped out. When you think about the statistics I just gave you about the declining employers based in Michigan and lack of jobs in Michigan, you've got more lawyers competing for fewer opportunities, fewer clients. A thriving middle class has always been an important staple for lawyers. That's where we get a lot of our business. And in Michigan these days, the middle class is not thriving. So that impacts, again, the bottom line. The results are threefold, none of which is good for ethics compliance. The first is you have the young attorneys who don't have the mentorship, so they can't avoid the problems that they don't see. The second is you have a lot of more experienced lawyers who used to be with big firms and had all the administrative support, and now they are being forced out to become solos through the economy. And we're seeing a lot of grievances filed against them just because they don't have the support staff, and all of a sudden they're getting a little sloppy and careless. And then the third thing is the most experienced lawyers are still forced to fight at any cost to keep their clients because they're becoming less and less loyal. Now, when you have a win-at-all-cost mentality to keep your clients, that's when you see the Enrons. That's when you see the Wall Street. That's when you see the lawyers who, trying to maintain their client relationship, are willing to do what it takes to keep the client. Sometimes meaning that they will turn a blind eye to things that normally they would object to. It causes serious problems. Second thing that really impacts the practice of law these days is technology and the increasing pace of life. You know, when I started practicing law in 1988, we had one computer in the office and we had one plain paper fax machine. Now, fax machines are outdated. Nobody uses fax machines. We all have our little phones where we can get instant messages and email. And the clients expect they can send a message instantly, they can get an answer instantly. So there's a pressure on lawyers. It used to be if somebody sent you a letter, you would have days to contemplate the issue, draft a letter, send it back to them in the mail, and then they'd call you on the phone. That doesn't happen anymore. The Today Show had a great story last week about the death of the telephone call. Nobody's talking on the phone anymore. It's all instant messaging. I'd like to focus for a minute on criminal indigent defense. For many lawyers, one of the reasons we went to law school was Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. He was the man. He was the ethical man who took on the case that couldn't be won and fought his best. And that's what we all wanted to be when we grew up. Now, recently, the state of Michigan, there was a national study that showed that the state of Michigan is failing to meet its constitutional burdens to provide free legal defense for criminal defendants. Unfortunately, that's something that has to be addressed. But in today's economy, how can you pay for that? So that's another issue that we're going to have to address in the short term. Now, by and large, I'll submit to you that criminal defense attorneys are modern-day John Adams. And by that, I mean our founding father. A lot of people don't realize this. John Adams actually defended a British soldier who was accused of murder as a result of the Boston Tea Party, or excuse me, the Boston Massacre. He did that because he felt that it was more important that one guilty man might get off, or excuse me, that 99 guilty men might get off rather than have one innocent man wrongly convicted. And that's what the goal of our criminal defense attorneys are. The same thing on the shoes on the other foot, the prosecutors. Most of the prosecutors in our society are devoted civil servants who really try and see that justice with a capital J is done. But one side or the other inevitably slips, and when that happens, believe me, we hear about it. It's on the front page. So you hear about the criminal defense attorney who's getting paid in something other than money. Or you hear about the prosecutors like the Ted Stevens, the senator from Alaska, where unfortunately one of the prosecutors involved in that case committed suicide after he was accused of unethical behavior. And it happened in Detroit with the terrorism trials a few years ago where they were accused of prosecutorial misconduct. Things like that can't happen. When they do happen, the reaction among us is we realize that the person we thought was Superman is really just Clark Kent on steroids, to use the baseball analogy. And that hurts. There is good news. West Michigan's a great place to practice because the economy hasn't hit us as bad as it's hit others. There are fewer attorneys here, so with a small bar association, there's a collective reinforcement of our professional ethics. We really look at each other. We're running in front of the same judges, and if you cut corners in front of a judge once, they're going to let you remember it the next time. And that accountability is very crucial to why I enjoy practicing in West Michigan. In wrapping up, and I think this goes a little bit to what Mr. Ford was saying, you know, when I was first interviewing and I was asked, you know, how I conducted myself, why did I conduct myself a certain way, I used to say that my guiding principle was I didn't want to do anything that would embarrass my parents. And now I have a daughter who's a freshman at U of M, which I can tell you just pleases me beyond anything. But with that perspective, now I live my life so that when my daughter thinks of what honesty and integrity means, I want her to think of me first. And I think that that's the lesson for, I know we've got some Cooley Law students here, that's my parting shot to you. That's the way to conduct yourself. Thank you very much.
All right, we will entertain your questions. So if you have questions, please write them down and pass them along. My understanding is that the first question is coming from Mr. Ford for our panelists.
Yes. Question for anybody on the panel. As we're sitting here, I thought one of the most important things you said was how technology has changed our society. And so I would ask your perspective of both technology and pop culture, because we somewhat isolate ourselves and not person to person, face to face, we text people instead of calling them. How does that affect going deep enough to even think about ethics as opposed to saying, well, it's my own personal opinion?
Well, I guess that was something that I had brought up, so I'll take the first shot at it. You know, people say things on the internet that they would never say face to face. I think that ethics is the golden rule. And if you're seeing somebody face to face, you will treat them the manner in which you hope to be treated. When we are so reliant now on technology and emails and instant messaging and things like that, where you don't make the personal connections, I think that inevitably leads to a greater sense of me versus we. So I think that is a very important thing. As far as pop culture, I do think that pop culture tends to glamorize those who are out of the norm. The people who are getting away with things are the ones who are all over the news. The teenage mother shows. If I would have mentioned teenage motherhood to my mother back when I was in high school, I'd had a bar of soap in my mouth. And now they're glorified. So I do think that we have to have a serious discussion about keeping that in check and making sure that people realize that is not the norm, that is not the accepted, that is the aberration.
Well, of course, in politics, your word is your bond, and that's very important. So what technology has done a little bit is made it a little tougher because what happens is you're a little more cautious than you used to be. I remember when I first started emails, using them in government, my answers on my emails to my staff were yes, no, thank you. Well, because you didn't want to say anything that would go, viral, and there you went. And I've changed a little bit, I modified a little bit, but still, unfortunately, what that does, I think, is it makes it hard to make decisions because you don't get all the information. Now, answering my staff with yes and no was probably not, everything they needed to know in order to get their job done, and also with constituents, to dealing with those folks and answering their issues. Whereas on one-on-one, you could talk a little bit more, you could have a little bit more nuance with what you're saying to help people get to a decision or help people understand where you were coming from. So I think that's hurt that. I still try to have face-to-face. I'm big on that. And when you're making a decision and when you've got a group of folks together and you have to make decisions and then go forward as a team out from that. So, and then of course technology too is changed on. There's just so much of it out there, too, and consistency on what you say is huge. And I feel for some elected officials out there sometimes because they've said it one way 1,000 times, and then the newspaper reporter got them a little bit off to one, and all of a sudden there they are, even though, they've said it 1,000 times one way. And so that is the challenge out there now with all of that because your word is your bond in this business.
If I could give one short illustration. About 6 months ago, when I was working at the Pentagon, one of my staff came up to me, former West Pointer, former major in the U.S. Army, now a DOD civilian, and he was quite upset. And he had just gotten a phone call from the Times of London. They had figured out, based upon the documents that had been put on WikiLeaks, where he was over in Iraq in 2004, and therefore they were attributing certain behavior to him based upon knowing what the incident reports were. What's not widely known is that this war, unlike any war we've ever prosecuted before, Anytime you leave a forward operating base, go outside the wire, as we used to say, and you have some sort of contact with the enemy or with the civilian, you have to do the equivalent of a police incident report. All those incident reports, of course, were classified to protect the civilians as well as our own soldiers. A lot of those, thousands of those, were put on the WikiLeaks. Did they have a lot of intelligence value? Not to an outsider. But clearly, here was this individual and his behavior, because they were able to figure out who he was, because once upon a time, there was a favorable story about him in the Washington Post. They took that period of time which they knew about, they took the documents on WikiLeaks, they were able to combine the two and make certain assumptions, which may or may not have been correct, but assumptions about this soldier who had served his country honorably, who had to make very quick ethical decisions in a very adverse environment, and now they were trying to make him a public figure as a result of that. So that calculus that I was saying, that tension between the collective good and the individual good, has not caught up with the technology that we have. There is still too much of a focus on the individual self-interest, and that collective good, in this case, has not balanced that out.
The first question is for you, General McDaniel, along the lines of the balance between the common good and the personal good. The first question is, or a statement actually, portions of the original Patriot Act seem to act at times to overstep our citizens' rights. How would you respond to that, and how do you think the balance has been struck in that legislation?
It should be noted that some of the most controversial provisions of the Patriot Act were up for renewal. They were all the controversial provisions as a result of the fact that Congress was trying to get that act through very quickly in the days after September 11, 2001. They sunsetted those provisions. So they have come up for renewal on a couple of occasions. And those are the ones having to do with the library, having to do with roving wiretaps. Those type of controversial provisions have come up to Congress on a number of occasions since then. And there has been the sort of debate that I think that we need to have. Again, you can see that there is that tension there where they're trying to say, what's the balance? And Congress is still struggling with that, which I think is absolutely appropriate under our constitutional system.
Okay. This is a question for each panelist. What was the most difficult professional ethical challenge you faced? What guided you?
Well, I'm not sure I have the courage of Steve Ford to put the drawbridge to my soul down on this one, but one of the earliest that I can recall was when I first started with the Attorney General's office here in Michigan, and Frank Kelly was the Attorney General, as he was for almost 40 years at that point in time, and was certainly one of my earliest mentors. And we had a lawsuit where it was necessary, I was in the environmental division at that time, it was necessary to sue 5 of the cities in Macomb County because there was groundwater contamination from a landfill that they owned into the groundwater, into the drinking wells of some of their citizenry. And they responded in part in a political way in that I was called to Frank Kelly's office and go into his conference room, and there's the mayors of all 5 cities, and there's their state reps and state senators. And they kind of went through. Frank Kelly comes in, sort of pats me on the shoulder and doesn't say anything to me. And they go through, and they're, of course, chewing me out and in essence, demanding that this lawsuit, which is brought by the government against the government, doesn't serve any good purpose, and our efforts should be spent elsewhere. And Frank Kelly heard them all out, and then he just looked at him and he says, you know what? In his very sort of candid style, he says, you stay the hell out of the judicial process, and I'll stay out of the legislative process. If you have any questions, Mr. McDaniel will answer them. And then he walked out and left me to sort of stare at them, and I won't tell you the response of some of the representatives. But my point is that you will always have sort of that decision as to where you're saying, am I doing the right thing? Few of us will be in the position that Mr. Ford mentioned that his father was, where He can take counsel of all, but this decision is ultimately his. Most cases, we will have some mentor that we can rely upon. But I say to the law students out there, you will have that ethical dilemma. So, as Bruce said, have your mentors in place and make that decision based upon what's right and what's most transparent for your client and for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have to live with yourself. That's the bottom line of all of this. And I would say, not quite specific as what you talked about, but on a daily basis, as when I was the Secretary of State, I'm a Republican and I had a Democrat governor, and I had a Republican legislature in the Senate and a Democrat in the House. So on a daily basis, there was this give and take between all these branches branches of government in order to make decisions. Now, it is the art of the compromise, but you have to make sure that when you're compromising, you're not compromising yourself. And there were a lot of challenges with that. I won't name the legislators here because that would not work here. But there was a few, even within my party, that were very insistent on certain things that they wanted. And I was like, no, that's not going to work in the long haul. And you have to keep that up, knowing full well. In fact, I had one of them explain to me that my budget would be looked at very closely next year if I didn't help them on a certain issue. And I said, well, my budget's pretty darn good. So I'm not going to worry about that. And the reality was the next year, they weren't in the legislature. So, you can't make decisions on what, I don't want to call it a threat, but what, they talk about now and what could happen in the future. You really have to make that decision for what works now, because the future can change, let me tell you. And I have worked with a lot of candidates and a lot of newcomers, and I remind them that all the time with a lot of new freshmen, that what happens today might be so different tomorrow. So don't worry about that. Make what decision you need to today, and in a process where you've got so many different people pulling in different places, that's very important to do, because the next day can be very different.
Well, I'd say I have to preface my comment by saying that as a practicing lawyer, I take very seriously my role as an officer of the court, and I think it's critical as a litigator who goes before the courts all the time that the court has to know when I'm telling them something, they can count on my word. With that introduction, I ran into a situation that I'm sure other attorneys have run into, but it's one when it hits you right in the face. It's a jolt, and that was I was representing a woman who, and actually I was doing it on a pro bono basis. She was having her house foreclosed upon, and absolutely believed her 1,000% that what she was telling me was true. That they had forged her signature on these documents, that it wasn't her signature. Felt so sure about that I hired an expert out of Lansing, former FBI agent, who came in and took writing samples from her, and we gathered all sorts of documentation and sent it back. And he came back to me and said, well, I've got good news for you. And I said, what's that? And he says, you won't have a pro bono case much longer. Because what he told me was that based on his analysis, there was a 95% certainty that that was her signature. And given that, I could not, in good conscience, go before the court with it. So I ended up having to withdraw as her counsel. And it was, the firm had spent a lot of resources on that file. I had invested a lot of personal time, and I am somebody who commits to my clients, and that was a very difficult conversation I had to have with her, but absolutely the right one.
Another question, compound question for each panelist. Is there a decline in mutual respect and ethical behavior in American society today? And if so, what accounts for this decline? And how can we address it?
I thought about that quite a bit as I was trying to come up with my definition of an ethic. And whether it was the behavior of the states during the Articles of the Confederation, whether it was the political climate when Andrew Jackson was elected and the slurs towards his wife, whether it was the state of the country with the Rutherford B. Hayes, Sam Tilden, and that disputed election at that point in time, whether it was more recently with the Red Scare, or as Mr. Ford said with Watergate, it is hard to say that this is the worst of times, and I really sort of reject that if we look at this country on a historical basis. We are incredibly resilient as a people and as a nation because of the way that our founding documents, the way that the Constitution was worded. And I think that if anything, that I believe, having thought about this over the last month, getting ready for today, I think that if anything, that I came away somewhat reassured. It is so easy to pick examples because we have so many different media sources now. We are not. It is to the point where every individual, to build upon what Bruce said, everybody that's got their own iPhone is their own media source and can create their own media. So instead of having, the 3 networks, we now have 300 million networks out there potentially. And as a result of that, we are bombarded with bad news, and the good news, of course, is somehow filtered out the way the spam used to be. So I think that if you take it superficially, it would seem that way, but I refuse to believe that we have lost civility compared to before. I think that, if anything, it is just the swing of the pendulum politically once more.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think it's changed. I mean, when I was in those campaign meetings back in '76, everybody was yelling and screaming at each other. It wasn't very civil, let me tell you. But there were no TVs, no whatever, and we all just walked out and smiled afterwards. So, I don't think that's changed. But what has changed a little bit is the technology. And if I can make a little comparison here in the sense of what Watergate was, is, breaking into campaign headquarters and stealing files to find out what the opposition was doing. Well, what's the difference between that now and Governor Palin when her email was hacked? I mean, that's the same thing. The young man broke into her email to find out, what they were doing on the campaign and what was going on. What's different than that than breaking into a headquarters and finding, some papers on the campaign? So it hasn't changed. It's just the technology and what's happened. And I even had a personal experience with that. I was on the Detroit Economic Board, and President Bush Sr. had come to give a speech, and this is a while back, of course, and they left the speech in the room. He went off to do a private reception. Somebody went and got the speech. It was a big, major speech on the economy and manufacturing, and so they were able to leak that out before he gave the speech. I mean, so it still happens out there. It's just that it's a little different than it was before. We're still all human, and I think that's always going to probably be the case. So,
I am very pleased to say that when I run into unethical conduct by a lawyer, it still shocks me. So I think that's a very good sign. And I think, I didn't have a month to prepare since Tony just took ill, but I had a couple of days to think about it. And I am a history major, undergrad, which, going back historically, I agree, there were so many battles, hard fought, uncivil along the way. And in fact, I did come across a quote from Mark Twain. It is curious that physical courage should be so common in the world and moral courage so rare. So this debate that we're having today has been going on. Mark Twain died, I think, in 1910. So it's been going on for 100 and some years in our country. I believe that things are not as bleak, but I'm always a half full type of guy.
Every older generation bemoans the ethical behavior of our youth. Do you share the concern about the ethics of our children, or do you behold ethics in our youth? Why?
I am sure that my daughter is the most ethical person because she knows if she runs afoul of me, I learned things from my Italian grandmother. No, I do believe our kids are struggling. A part of it goes back to the pop culture, the role models that they're seeing broadcast on TV, I don't think reflect what we want them to see. I think it's more important than ever for parents to set the guidelines and to be good role models and to have conversations a lot earlier than I know my parents had to have with me. But I do think our kids, I am on a nonprofit board, West Michigan Center for Arts and Technologies, where we deal with urban core students. And our goal is to keep them in high school by exposing them to fine arts and technology. The kids that I meet over there come from the worst backgrounds you can imagine, and I never come out of that building without being uplifted. So, again, they renew my hope, but I am very confident in our youth.
I do a lot of counseling with candidates. I'm always a teacher, I guess, still yet. But and one of the things that I've noticed with the younger ones is I don't think there's a lack of morals or values, because I think the parents have done a pretty good job with that. Things that I find that's been most interesting is just a little bit more about taking the shorter way around rather than the long way. And because I remember when I was younger, you started at the bottom and then you worked up and you did all of that. There's not so much of that anymore. It's like, let's go to the top right now. And I think in doing that, you don't gain that wisdom that you get from the years of experience. And not that some people can't do that when they're younger and move up, but I do think that experience and that relationships and the fact that you've worked at it a little bit and understand how it works that is important. So that's what I see more as the challenge.
Just briefly, same answer. Ethics is not innate, it's learned behavior. We have to have the institutions in place. It's the Boy Scout oath, it's the Boy Scout law. It's those behaviors being taught at an early age, and so that they become so inculcated that they become the ethical base for those individuals. So if there is a blame, then it is on us as the older generation.
All right. One final question, and we'll start off with you, General McDaniel. Do ethics matter when dealing with evil, i.e. Iran or Libya?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We, to maintain our moral place in this world, as that nation on the shining hill, which we like to perceive ourselves as, we have to be not only moral as an individual, but moral as a nation. So we have to have very reasoned debate before we make decisions about the use of force in countries like Libya, just as we could have had greater debate in some of our other recent incursions. I remember well the reaction of my colleagues and military leaders when decisions were made very quickly to go into Afghanistan and Iraq, because when you commit this nation's blood and treasure, that is a commitment has to be a commitment of the entire nation. And the people of Libya, I believe, are looking for democracy. They will model themselves to the extent that they can within the extent of their culture after the United States. But it's not because we are a nation of military force. It is because we are a nation of democracy and a nation of moral values.
Well said. I guess I would just agree with that, in that, you have to reflect on why you're doing this, and make sure that you understand what the reasons are, and that it commits folks to, it has to be a total commitment. And then also, it has to be a world commitment. I mean, we're on a world stage, so we have to talk to our fellow countries out there and make sure that we're, on the same page, and we also have to make sure that we're, loyal, and our word means what it means. And I just think that's hugely important. And sometimes you have to make those tough decisions, and it's a challenge. And but we're in these kind of times now, and that's just really what's the world is about right now. So
I think that question wraps up today's discussion perfectly, because it's only when you're forced to face evil, when you're forced to face a bad choice, that you have the inner debate. My mom always used to say, if you go to bed with dogs, you're going to wake up with fleas. That's the debate that you have to have. And whether it's dealing with a despot, whether it is dealing with a political opponent who wants to take advantage of some leverage that he or she perceives, or whether it's dealing with an unethical lawyer, you cannot bow down and engage in the behavior which you yourself would condemn.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Ford has closing remarks for us.
What a fascinating debate. We could go on for hours. I have so many questions for all of you, and I thank you for being here. And I think you did wrap it up. Dad would be so pleased today that this was the town square, and we got to discuss things. I know I speak to a lot of kids across the country. Tell them about my alcoholism, what I went through, try to help them avoid some of the pitfalls and choices and decisions. And I know I don't have any children of my own, but I know my girlfriend's 2 kids who are teenagers. I look at talking about this information, instant access. There's no, what do I say, delay of gratification. Everything is now. And it does wear away. And I think we as adults, our biggest, and I think Dad would tell you the same thing, we need to teach this. We need to show young people this. We need to plant the seeds. And the seeds that we plant today about ethics, character, integrity, leadership, and this isn't partisan politics. The Democrats don't own it more than the Republicans. It's ethical behavior. Plant those seeds in those kids today. We'll see a harvest later. But, my old ag instructor in college when I was an ag major used to tell me, you can't stick broccoli seeds in the ground and expect to see corn next spring. It just doesn't work. Whatever you put in the ground today is going to show up later. And our biggest commitment must be to our young people. Thank you all very much. We're going to have a little reception in the lobby afterwards. Thank you very much for being here, and we're very grateful. Thank you very much.